I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Daryl Ireland, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. We've corresponded for the last 6 months about this, finally got to meet him today. It's really exciting. And he's a research assistant professor of mission at Boston University, and he focuses on the history of Christianity in Asia as well as intersection of international development and faith. He's the author of John Sung, Modern Chinese Christianity and the Making of a New Man. And his latest book, published last week, is Visions of Salvation, Chinese Christian Posters in an Age of Revolution. Literally published, this is hot off the press. And we have copies in the back. He's going to be selling some copies afterwards. Following Dr. Ireland's presentation, I've invited Dr. Andrew Kaiser, who is a China Source Associate and regular contributor. He's going to be coming up and facilitating the question and answer session that we'll have afterwards. So Dr. Ireland, thank you for coming, and we really look forward to what you have to say.
Well, good evening. It is exciting for me to be here, and I am thrilled with the opportunity to share with you the discovery or the rediscovery of Chinese Christian posters. I hope that by the end of the evening, as you've looked closely at some of these posters, you begin to understand why they can so powerfully illuminate our understanding of the place of Christianity in China in the first half of the 20th century. But before I get really started, I want to pause to just echo what Joanne was saying. We are really grateful to the many sponsors of tonight's event. She did an excellent job outlining that, but I also want to single out Joanne Pittman for doing a phenomenal job of coordinating all those institutions and people so that we can be here tonight. Joanne, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. All right, let's talk about posters. When the communists swept to power in 1949, they swept away their rivals. And that included erasing the most public dimension of Chinese Christianity at the time. That is their Christian posters. These had been printed by the millions, and they were pasted on city walls. They were tacked onto temple gates. You could find them in tea rooms. They were even unfolded for street evangelism. I'm telling you, these posters were everywhere until they weren't. They disappeared and were forgotten. My path of rediscovery happened 7 years ago when, after speaking about Christianity in China, a woman approached me and asked me an unusual question. Could I help her answer questions about Chinese Christian posters she had found? Her story was really rather remarkable. Her grandfather, Sergeant Daryl Ireland, had served in China during World War II. He had survived his tour and had returned to the United States, but on his way back home, his train derailed and he tragically died. He never made it back, only his trunk did. And his widow put that up in the attic and told her daughter not to play with it, and later her grandchildren not to touch it. But she had recently passed away, and when they were going through her stuff, they finally opened that trunk, and so here came the question. Can you help us with these posters that we found? Her story jogged my memory, and I became vaguely aware that I had seen maybe posters before in a photograph like this, but until I actually had seen a live picture like that, did my imagination really come alive, and I realized that this was something important. This is such a powerful image, that just the size and the brightness of the colors captivated my imagination. And later, when Sandra Baldwin, the daughter of Daryl Ireland, decided to donate her dozen posters to Boston University, I really thought we might have the world's largest collection of Chinese Christian posters. I mean, they are so rare and they're so fragile. How could anyone else have more, right? Well, it was my wife, Dr. Francisca Ireland Verwoerd, who was not resting on her laurels, but was at the computer typing away and sort of shouting over her shoulder, "Hey, Daryl, have you contacted Wheaton College? It looks like they have more posters." And they had a lot more posters. You're seeing just a small sampling outside. But so did many other libraries and archives around the world. And over the last 7 years, I've managed to compile more than 700 different Chinese Christian posters from 4 different continents. We've digitized them, and they're now freely available at ccposters.com. If you can't remember it, just type in Chinese Christian posters, ccposters.com. And when we assembled these 700 posters, it was like discovering a mosaic where a new pattern emerged, and you could see things that we had never recognized before. And I guess if I have one takeaway from this long project, it would be this: archives are dangerous places. They can absolutely upend our conventions and challenge our long-held belief facts. It means that the communists, in this case, the so-called winners, don't always get to write the history. Because, as John Adams famously quipped, facts are stubborn things. And I'm telling you, these posters are stubborn things. Since they've resurfaced, they've been telling us a different kind of story. This evening, I'm going to share with you 5 forgotten stories. They're all unpacked at greater length in that new book, Visions of Salvation, but let me give you just 5 teasers tonight. Instead of one in-depth lecture on one aspect of the posters, I hope that you are going to walk away with one in-depth impression. These Christian posters might just upend what we thought about Christianity in China in the first half of the 20th century. Now let me try to explain why. In 1926, the Chinese nationalists and communists briefly teamed up to defeat the regional warlords and recreate a central ruling power in China. As the army marched north to destroy their enemies, they went behind a phalanx of pamphleteers who were handing out tracts and hanging up posters. And the director of the Religious Tract Society watched all of this with some envy. And he said, they're using our means and improving upon them. How is it that these people are more creative and imaginative in winning the hearts of the masses than we are to win them for Jesus Christ? And he challenged all believers in China, do propaganda work for your Lord and Master. In 1927, just a few months later, the National Christian Council of China responded to his plea, and they sent out posters to the 1/3 of Protestant congregations in China that were under their umbrella. And they arrived in stacks of 100. And these weren't to be pasted up in the sanctuary or discussed in a Sunday school classroom. The instructions are very clear. They're right here on the bottom. Please put up in a public space. And you can see that this poster, as it goes into a public space, is co-opting political imagery. Instead of what we just saw previously, the nationalist army sort of shoveling out China's enemies, or actually sort of anticipating that communist image with Mao directing the armies that we started with, here you see Jesus as China's true revolutionary. He's the one, as it says there on the flag, who's creating a new China. But this isn't supposed to be happening. I mean, scholars have known that Chinese Christians were politically active in the early 20th century. In the 1912 election, 22% of the people who were sent to the legislature were Christians, despite being less than 1% of the population. But by 1922, China was in the grips of a fierce anti-Christian movement. And this political activism began to retreat into a more safe and private piety. At least that's what we've always assumed. And the story goes on that if there was any leftover political action from Christians, that was strangled in 1927 when the nationalists and the communists teamed up to throttle it. But clearly, These posters tell us otherwise. Christians were continuing to put forward in public spaces answers to the most politically debated questions of their time, like, how are we going to 救国? How are we going to save this nation? And the answer, of course, is something like this. You turn to Christ. And turning to Christ is not just about inviting him privately and safely into your heart. In these posters, Jesus was to play a more public role in transforming the nation. Think about this. Chinese politicians were both elated and panicked when the Qing dynasty fell in 1911. It was an exciting time. This was a new day in China. But what was going to hold the country together? Without an emperor, how were the 5 ethnic groups of China going to hang together? Sun Yat-sen tried to explain to his fellow citizens, if we can't find a way to unite, then foreign powers are going to continue to pull us apart. So he tried to symbolize the new era in China by creating a new national symbol. 5 colors for the 5 ethnic groups of China in one national flag. Now, look at this poster. See how it perfectly replicates the colors of China? You have the 5 ethnic groups there. And don't be deceived that this is just a cute children's poster. This was actually explicitly made for adults, because this is a political message. Jesus is holding China together. It's only his embrace that can bring together the 5 ethnic groups. Now, admittedly, that's a bold political message, and I suspect many viewers balked when they saw it. But my point is this: we can no longer pretend that Christians weren't making this kind of point. They were actively pushing for a vision of national salvation in which Christ was the centerpiece of the country's transformation. Granted, the loving arms of Jesus is a pretty weak recipe for nation building. But it's hardly less vacuous than nationalist and communist posters of the time. Propaganda posters are not about outlining specific policies for building a nation. They are about painting aspirational visions. And at that level, Christians could and did compete with political parties. They had their own way to say, we have a pathway for China's salvation. Number 2. If you know nothing else about fundamentalists and modernists in the first half of the 20th century, perhaps you know this: they really didn't like each other. In China, they said all kinds of nasty things about one another. Fundamentalists called modernists apostates, dupes of Satan. Modernists, on the other hand, despised fundamentalists and called them narrow-minded, moss-backed, and fossil-like. The rift was so deep that the two sides could find no common ground. They ended up building their own institutions, printing their own journals. They even had their own separate summer retreats because they could literally find no common ground on which to stand together. At least, that's what we've always assumed based on the written record. It's shocking to discover that these posters tell a very different story. In fact, if we only had these posters to rely on, like we've relied on sermons, articles, and books for the last century, we would have actually assumed that fundamentalism and modernism never even reached China's shores. Because visually speaking, the two were almost identical. I've already started by referencing the common Protestant political vision, both fundamentalists and modernists, were busy printing posters that tried to show that Christianization was China's pathway to national salvation. But the crossover went beyond that. First, fundamentalists and modernists both saw deep problems in China's new economic order. Urban areas in particular were deeply concerning because new class structures were emerging that had never existed in the countryside. And the bourgeoisie were amassing enormous wealth and extraordinary power because they controlled the means of production. And the communists were protesting this until the nationalist government drove them out of the cities and pushed them into remote hinterlands beyond its reach, where they tried to regroup in tiny Soviets. That left it to Christians to be the ones to speak about the gross inequalities that were surfacing, especially since the nationalist government hitched itself to a bourgeois plan for modernization. So in this context, Protestants of all stripes condemned the unequal distribution of wealth categorically. Every single time a poster appears with money in it, it's always in a negative connotation. I particularly love this poster. It's about to appear here. Produced by the Fundamentalist Religious Tract Society, you will get a picture of China's new urban elite. He's a cosmopolitan man, right? Who's turned his global awareness and connections into lucrative gain. But what I find most interesting is right here. Can you imagine a better way to express that everywhere the bourgeoisie look, they only see money? Whether they're looking at the sky, the land, the water, their family, they're all there to be exploited and to be turned into cash. And this poster, by the text around it, makes it clear anyone that blinded by mammon is doomed to destruction. Meanwhile, the modernists were also protesting wealth disparities in their own ways. Here you have someone lounging in his recliner, and the poster is asking, how unjust is this? Are you really in a recliner, or are you on the backs of exploited laborers? You've got to make things right. It's the subtext of the imagery here. Or to approach the matter from another angle, sometimes the modernists from the YWCA would create posters like this, talking about the exploitation of the working class. Here's a woman who has to clock 12 hours in the factory and then take care of her children, cook, clean, and still manage to sneak in a few hours of sleep. Or they might show you the average income of a working class person who has to put 56% of the money they make back into their belly. All of that went for food. That's a recipe for endless insecurity. Despite what you might think, time and again, fundamentalists and modernists converged in protest over this kind of social issue. But it didn't end there. Fundamentalists and modernists presented the Bible in the same terms. And that's absolutely shocking. That's a jaw-dropping statement because the one thing that they fought about was the Bible. Fundamentalists said that the Bible was God's only authority. It's the authoritative word. That's the only thing we can rely on. And they hated the way modernists used geology, biology, and physics to sort of sift through the text to see what was really true. Fundamentalists said that to do such a thing was to reduce God's revelation to human reason. It was tantamount to idolatry. And so, with the argument framed that way, you can see that the things that they fought about were reduced to pretty predictable lists. They battled over the virgin birth, miracles, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is what captured their fights and their imagination. And so you would think when the fundamentalists went to print their own posters, they would emphasize the miraculous. That's what makes them different. But in fact, they did no such thing. They actually minimized the miraculous. And like the modernists, reduced their stories of the Bible almost entirely to parables. A comparison with the Roman Catholic posters at this point might be useful. I have so far tracked down 67 Catholic posters that based on New Testament stories, and only 6 illustrate a parable. The others are focused on the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The emphases of Protestant posters, on the other hand, are inverted. 16 posters capture a story about Jesus, while 56 posters tell us a story told by Jesus. And these stories told by Jesus, these parables, they are without supernatural elements. Jesus relished in the everydayness of yeast being worked into dough or a farmer to help a tree grow. And of course, this avoided fights over God violating supernatural laws, but it also meant that modernists and fundamentalists looked very much the same. Even when they dared to depict a scene from the life of Jesus, both modernists and fundamentalists minimized the miraculous. Take the virgin birth, for example. This was a point of intense debate among Protestants, but only Catholics actually disturbed the scene with supernatural actors. The fundamentalist religious tract society, on the other hand, perhaps its most distinguishing feature is its naturalism. And the more liberal Anglican Church in China's poster only sort of alludes to unusual events by making one star slightly larger than another. Fundamentalists and modernists both downplayed the life of Jesus with its high concentration of miracles in favor of highlighting his teaching. They turned him into China's new moral guide. Stop doing evil and learn to do good is how one poster summarized the message of the prodigal son. It's unknown whether this poster comes from a fundamentalist or modernist printing house, but that's what makes it so interesting. The content gives us no clue. The fact is, stop doing evil, learn to do good is precisely what you could expect appended to any Protestant poster that depicted something from the Bible. For despite all their vitriol, when it came to their visual messages, fundamentalists and modernists both chose to communicate that morals, not miracles, is the real key to salvation. Once again, we see the power of these posters to upend our conventions and to surprise our certain facts. We have long assumed that fundamentalists and modernists were irreparably divided in China. But when it came to politics, social issues like class disparities, or preaching in pictures, they were in fact indistinguishable. The 1920s and 30s and 40s were hugely important for the Roman Catholic Church. It was in this period that they set out to indigenize the faith. That is, make it less European and more Chinese. Art was a major contributor in that effort. Cioso Constantini, who had the rank of an archbishop, arrived in China in 1922 with an agenda. He was going to use Chinese artistry to express the Christian faith. And he managed to build a remarkable team of artists, most of whom, this is interesting, were converted while painting Christian pictures at Furen University, shown there, the Catholic University in Beijing. And if you go ahead and forward it, we can see that team of artists. This group consciously worked to express Christianity in Chinese idioms. Now, on this point, I want to thank the artist and scholar He Qi, who contributed to this book, for helping me see how these Furen artists managed to incorporate Chinese brushstrokes and art techniques into their paintings. In this picture, for instance, you see how the Catholic poster on the right incorporated what's called Ma's Corner, named after the ancient Chinese artist Ma Yuan, who famously would paint one corner in great detail and then leave the opposite corner in an evocative emptiness to balance it out. And here, of course, you see the same in action. Or in other paintings, you can see how Catholic artists would take a painting of the Bodhisattva, Guan Yin, a popular deity in Buddhism, and take that imagery and transpose it onto the Virgin Mary so that you could understand that Mary was also tender and compassionate. Another way to indigenize the faith was to put it on Chinese soil. It did not always make great geographical sense. I mean, here you have the Holy Family on a less than frantic escape to Egypt. And they're crossing what appears to be a Chinese lake to go to the other side of the shore, which we all assume was not Egypt. But that's not really the point. The point is that Jesus belongs in China. And here you have shepherds who are visiting a Chinese family. So Chinese, in fact, that Mary has draped her head in a white cloth, the sign of a new mother. Constantini rejoiced at these works as they were painted and then printed on posters. He heralded them as creating a new Catholic Chinese style, and others agreed. In fact, these posters became extremely popular, with special exhibits of them organized in places like Vienna, Paris, and Rome. But there are two underlying ironies here. First, while it is true that they became enormously popular in the West, the Catholics in China largely ignored or rejected them. As the scholar Chu Xiaobai has recently noted, few Chinese Catholics even bothered with these posters, but when they did, it was to complain. They looked too Buddhist, and why did we have to be so historically inaccurate? The attempt to sinicize Catholicism was not rejected by the West, but ironically, in the East. Second, Stephanie Wong writes in her chapter in this book on posters that one can't help but notice how the artists chose to depict Chineseness in very traditional terms. The Mary, Joseph, and Jesus always appear in traditional clothes. Even modern people were wearing traditional Chinese clothes. And they all uphold traditional values. If you go back to that one just for a second, like Jesus being so filial, serving his Father. And the problem was that this kind of traditional culture was under assault in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, having bound feet, like the woman in the upper right-hand corner of this poster, was quickly disappearing as a sign of beauty and becoming a mark of national disgrace. Or the Chinese robes that the men are appearing here and are featured in this next poster, which is a Protestant poster, in the top left corner. Those Chinese robes are no longer seen to be really anything more than this dirty, filthy rags. They symbolized backwardness, whereas Protestants were saying China's new culture is going to be modern, with a modern suit. You see, the Catholic Church tried to adopt Chinese culture, but discovered that Chinese culture is anything but homogeneous. It ended up latching onto a version of Chinese life that was attractive to the Catholic Church, but ended up, but also it was, as they latched onto a version of Chinese traditional culture that was attractive to the church, they ended up being disappointed because even as this sort of traditional China was being printed and coming off the presses, the posters were already anachronistic. That China was passing away. The takeaway from this? I believe, is that Catholic efforts at indigenization are praised, and understandably so. But the posters remind us that the process and the outcome were anything but predictable. They did not reinvigorate the faithful as much as they provided the Western church an attractive but ultimately illusory picture of Chinese Christianity. All right, number 4. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked the emergence of China's mass culture. Using new technologies, various prints and visual materials could be produced inexpensively and in massive quantities. Sometimes missionaries are remembered for bringing in the machinery that brought about this revolution. But even if they manage to sneak into the history books, which they usually don't, they are immediately dismissed as being irrelevant to later developments. I believe, however, that these posters demonstrate otherwise. China saw the explosion of that mass visual culture in the second quarter of the 20th century in 2 ways. You saw the emergence of propaganda posters and artistic advertisements. In fact, both these revolutions are just one innovation. Pictures had to become persuasive. The story usually goes like this. Communists first mastered the art of making ideology interesting. It didn't happen immediately. At first, they were carving wood blocks and stamping their posters in black and white. And their stark prints capture a lot of emotion. But truthfully, peasants found the color scheme dull. And, maybe somewhat like me, they're not even sure what was happening in this scene. It was only in 1940 that the communists began to defer to popular tastes and change their posters from angry images to more joyful, simple, and colorful pictures like this. And this is actually largely copying a Chinese New Year print, something that had circulated for centuries, even borrowing the symbolism of New Year's prints. Here you have a plum tree, something that represents spring. It's usually one of the first things to blossom in China, and so it became a symbol of renewal. And now you have the communists offering the same thing, renewal, except under the party's red star, tucked away there on the door. It was a breakthrough in political printmaking. People wanted these pictures because communists had finally discovered how to make their ideology attractive. Meanwhile, the other great innovation was in advertisement art. Businesses, so the story goes, discovered how to make their products not only useful, but their advertisements also beautiful. Calendar posters, in particular, became the art of the masses. A tobacco company might put a lovely landscape there in the middle, or as in this case, a beautiful woman, and then surround it by what appears to be a silk border, a kind of framing that would appear on any fine piece of Chinese art. On the side, you usually have poems, and at the bottom, a description of where you could get the product. These were powerfully transformative and became extraordinarily popular. You might imagine it something like Nike convincing us to wear its logos on our shirt. Companies could actually convince people to buy their advertisements. They could sell these posters. What is forgotten now in these 2 stories about the communists and businesses is how Christian posters were integral to that visual revolution. For example, Christian posters and advertisement posters appeared roughly at the same time. In fact, when the first 4-colored offset lithography machine arrived in Shanghai in 1920, it was not a tobacco company, but a Christian printing house that rushed to have the first posters made. And what they printed was akin to a calendar poster. Here you have the lovely landscape scene that seems to tell a story, and stories made posters even more attractive. You have the silk border, you have couplets on the side, at the bottom a description of the gospel, and usually instructions on where to get it. Please go to a church and hear the gospel and study the Bible. In so doing, Christians fused the two great visual revolutions of the time. Communists managed to make ideology interesting. Businesses discovered how to sell advertisements. But before all of that, Christians had already combined the two. They were selling their ideas. And when you grasp that, you cannot think about China's modern visual culture the same way again. Finally, let's talk about theology. Chinese theology is a vastly important topic, and we're very grateful for the great work being done in this field right now. Much of it's being translated into English because it has something important to say to the global church. However, what's being translated are works written by Chinese theologians. We are getting access to their books. And that's an appropriate place to begin, of course, but I just want to point out the print disparity. In 1929, the YMCA decided to print 4,000 copies of Y.T. Wu's new book, The Social Gospel. That was the biggest run of the year. This was going to be a book, an explosive book that would be on everyone's shelf. 4,000 copies. That same year, the Religious Tract Society printed 150,000 posters, an additional 1.5 million tract-size versions of those same posters. Do you see the gap here? The disparity is enormous between books and visual posters. There is no parity here. Posters swamped the book production. They were far and away the most public display of Christian theology. And since they were consciously facing outward, they sought ways to make their theology attractive and understandable. So what were the theological messages that Chinese Christian artists believed would be compelling to their compatriots? What might win their hearts for Christ? And Protestant artists thought about this carefully and crafted various posters to address the many needs of the average man or woman on the street, including how Christianity could improve labor conditions, or how it might help you get your children a modern education, or provide protection from common diseases, and of course, allow you to escape the terrors of hell and enjoy the bliss of heaven. However, the most common theme of Christian posters was undeniably the cross of Jesus Christ. Apparently, no other object, person, symbol, or text could communicate the gospel more clearly than the cross. Not even Jesus himself, who surprisingly is almost entirely absent from the posters. The cross is what became a highly condensed symbol that could speak to the desires of Chinese millions. Why was that? And what was it saying? First, we need to recognize how the cross came to substitute for Christ's presence. This is a great example. Here you have a cross illuminating a dark scene. The man on the bottom has turned his back to the cross, and his own body is casting a shadow over the Bible. And so he's scratching his head in confusion. The other man, on the other hand, is turned toward the cross, and the light illuminates the text, and he's absorbing the good news. Now, for someone familiar with the Bible, there are lots of illusions going on here. The light has come into the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. John chapter 1, verse 5. Or, for anyone who comes into the light, there is eternal life. John chapter 3, verses 18 to 21. Or, as it says at the very bottom, I am the light. John 8, verse 12. But what's significant is that most people who saw these posters didn't know the Bible and so couldn't pick up on these allusions. Visually speaking, I am the light refers to the cross, not to Christ. Let's pause there for a moment. I suspect some of you are thinking, well, it's not surprising that Jesus is not on the cross. Protestants never put him there because Jesus is not dead, but alive. And that's true. But that's not my point tonight. My point is, I am the light comes from John chapter 8, long before Jesus is crucified. But we don't see Jesus there. We see his cross. Apparently, artists believed the cross was a better ambassador of the gospel. So why was that? And what was the cross's good news? I think there are several answers, and you can read more about them if you buy the book. Check it out at your library. But let me focus on just two. First, the cross is strong. It offered stability in the midst of a chaotic world. Just look at the size of this cross. It's actually bigger than the whole world. Its sheer size conveys something about strength. Or consider this cross. That's not a cross for crucifixion, and not just because there's a clock in the middle of it. Imagine trying to stretch these poor guys' arms across that horizontal beam. I'm not even sure it would clear the clock. This is not about a tool of torture. This is a cross of enormity. It fills the entire page from top to bottom, left to right. This cross is massive, solid, and dependable. And probably no other poster captures that better than this monster. Oof. I mean, you can just feel the weight of that cross. And notice it's not brown, the color of wood, or even red, the symbol of blessing. This cross is blue and silver, reminiscent of that new, strong, powerful modern machine, the locomotive. This cross is unstoppable. It's unshakable. It's immovable. And to Chinese viewers in the first half of the 20th century, that meant a lot. In fact, it might have just meant everything. In the first decade of popular Christian poster production, China endured two devastating natural disasters. A famine in 1921 pushed 20 to 30 million people to the point of starvation and death, and in fact took the lives of 500,000. 10 years later, in 1931, fast-rising waters forced 52 million people to flee for their lives, and 2 million of them never escaped. And in between those two catastrophic natural disasters, China endured almost a dozen civil wars. It was devastated by economic sanctions. It was hammered by the worldwide Great Depression, and then watched helplessly as Japan annexed Manchuria. And as shocking as this sounds, the following decades, the 1930s and 40s, were arguably even worse. The nationalist and communist armies managed to turn regional conflicts into a national battle, and the invasion of Japan turned a national battle into a world war. China, in the heyday of Christian posters, was a country teetering on the brink of an abyss. No wonder viewers felt like they needed something strong to hold on to, and time and again, posters offered precisely that. The cross is a firm anchor, the only thing a person can count on in a tumultuous and dangerous world. If that isn't enough, then people might also embrace the cross because it is a gateway to a new and better life. You might think that since China was awash in tragedy and trauma, artists might try to turn to the cross for comfort, as others had done for centuries. This piece from Germany originally hung in a hospital and reminded patients that Jesus was a man of sorrows who carried our infirmities and sicknesses. But Chinese artists didn't use the cross for that purpose, and then instead they used it to communicate blessing. In fact, that's what they put on top of the cross, blessing, in this poster, in case you might miss the point. Part of the way they communicated its blessing was drawing on popular imagery. Here on the left-hand side, you see something that was common in newspapers from the time. China stands at a fork in the road. Down one pathway is death and destruction. Towards the other is life and salvation. And in this case, if we continue to buy foreign products, compatriots, our country's going to die. We need to buy Chinese-made products. And that's the pathway to life. Now, Christian posters adopted the two-road strategy all the time. Here's just one example. And that fork in the road is always divided by the cross. Now, you can ignore it and continue to travel on, but boy, you've got a hard road in life. It's curvy, those stones are uneven, you're weighted down with sin, and at the very bottom, you've got a viper waiting for you. And the ultimate road leads to fire and destruction. On the other hand, if you leave your sin behind, check out your road. It's perfectly straight and absolutely smooth. So much so that these people don't even have to look down. They just read their Bible as they stroll their ways into heaven. I mean, life gets better if you can make it through the cross. Or you can see the promise of an easier life here. If you can pass through the gateway of the cross, you are promised victory over sin. Or, as it says in some posters, you can leave your troubles behind. On the poster here on the right, we have another classic example. Sin pulling this woman down. She's holding her face in grief and shame. But if she can be set free on the cross, she is liberated to a new and better life. And significantly, in all of these posters, no one looks back. There's never a depiction of following Jesus' words to take up your cross daily and follow him. Because this cross is not a symbol of suffering, it offers you an escape from it. Or, to say it more positively, the cross in China promised viewers a better life and not merely a way to endure it. Because the cross became the central icon of Chinese Protestant Christianity, it especially received communist censure. In fact, after they took over, Christians still managed to produce posters for 2 years, in 1950 and 1951. But what you noticed is how dramatically the cross is reduced in size. In this poster, you might not even be able to see it, but it's there kind of as the steeple, just a tiny cross doing nothing more than marking this as a Christian building. It has really no theological message. And in the other poster, you certainly see the cross. It's dazzling, but it does little more than mark these young people as Christians. The cross had been drained of its power. That does not mean, however, that Chinese Protestants have forgotten the cross. In fact, it's still extraordinarily meaningful. And that's why I would argue that despite all the various challenges that Christians in China still face, the one thing that seems to mobilize them better than anything else is when a cross is pulled down from their church. That, more than anything else, is what is perceived as a direct assault on their faith. In fact, in Huai'an, where Ruth Graham Bell grew up, the church became so tired of the state removing the cross and then putting it back on and then having it removed again that they actually finally built the cross into the church. Try taking that down. Why would they go to such lengths? I believe it's because popular theology, born from these posters, is not so much Christocentric as it is crucicentric. The cross symbolizes salvation. So there you go. 5 quick stories about these posters and their potential to overturn tables, so to speak, when it comes to our conventions about Chinese Christianity and politics, fundamentalism and modernism, Roman Catholicism, visual culture, and theology. But there is still so much more. And I am grateful to Baylor University Press that recognized the power of these posters and allowed me to bring together a team of scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds. So we have political historians, social historians, missiologists, theologians, art historians, experts in visual culture, who all came together to write this book in separate chapters, and they each answered one question: what do you see in these posters? And from their different backgrounds, they discovered extraordinary stories and amazing finds. But what I'm most excited about is that there is still so much left untouched, and I'm convinced even still unnoticed. In that sense, tonight's talk and this book are really just an invitation to you. Look at these extraordinary posters. There is still so much to find. This is really just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to have some time now for questions. There's 2 mics here in the aisles. Please make your way forward. If you don't have questions, I have lots. So I'm sure Dr. Ireland would rather hear from you. Yes, Dr. Milner, please.
So I'm an art historian, so I've heard a lot of art history lectures. I think that was the top 5 I've ever heard. That was extraordinary. Yeah, unbelievable. Wow. And my goodness, what the research, astonishing. So here's my hard question, having said that. You said that the cross offers better life, not merely a way to endure. So let's imagine, as happens to be the case with some of us here, that we've been given that better life in Christ, and we're not being threatened every day by disaster, by flood. And we develop a sense of aesthetic sophistication, and we look at the cross, the big blue one, and we say, oh, well, I kind of prefer the Song Dynasty paintings that I saw in the National Museum that are labeled national treasures. Isn't there something, as I believe in the gospel, but isn't there something to be said for an attempt to go into thousands of years of Taoist and Buddhist art and Christianizing that? So is there more, perhaps, to Constantini's approach? Yeah. Please, I'd love to hear your answer.
It's a wonderful observation, a great question. And I think that we are still living through that transformation. Maybe as a historian, we recognize that these things don't happen instantly or overnight. And so, there was an immediate rejection in Constantini's time in the 1920s and 30s of these new Catholic prints that are trying to draw on that longer art history. But that was 100 years ago. And you begin to see sort of a second, third generation beginning to say, how can I not just be Christian, but also Chinese? And in that sense, begin to try to recover a deeper and longer tradition that can give another layer of meaning to something like the cross.
Thank you. Yes, next question, please.
Well, first a comment. You were showing some of the attempts to express Jesus' parables in Chinese terms and suggesting that it was more popular in the West than it was in China. But we also, I know up in the archives, we have at least a dozen or more of parable posters, which are strictly in terms, the people and the clothing and everything else is strictly in terms of first century Palestine. So it was expressing, and these are extremely huge posters, bigger than most of the others in general. But your talk made me think about the poster publishing industry. I was wondering about how people found the posters they wanted to buy and put up. Were there catalogs? I mean, we've never come across a catalog that I know of Chinese posters, but it seems to me a catalog would also be a way of analyzing the messages that people were trying to put out and the messages that they expected the audience to want.
Yeah.
I was wondering if any of those survived. And the other question was, with poster publishing, You mentioned the artists and what they were trying to convey, but who determined what the messages would be? Who determined what the different product they were going to be putting out would be? And I mean, it might be difficult to figure that out, but was it the publishers, the artists, church leaders? How did those things, how was that determined? And then thirdly, you said that poster publishing survived for about 2 years afterwards. Did it move to Hong Kong and Taiwan, or did it just die completely?
Wow, great questions. You might need to stay there because if I don't remember all three, you can keep me faithful. So the first thing is, one of the challenges in doing the research on this is most of the Christian publishing house records were destroyed. The most complete archive I have is from the Religious Tract Society, and I have seen catalogs of what they were trying to put out. So there is something there, and you're right, and this I think bleeds into your second question in terms of how you see publishing houses respond to the market. I took this set of images out, but I have this marvelous one, and I believe it's in the book, where you see the same poster where someone is about to go over the cliff, and at the bottom are the flames of hell. And then you see the same poster where those flames are removed. Why is that? I believe it's because they were responding to the market. Were they being told to turn the flames up or down? I'm not sure, because they actually came out in the same year. But you had a choice. And I believe the choice, the fact that these became mass market pieces where you could sell your posters, meant that you were also constrained by the tastes of your audience. And I think we see that playing out in the poster. Now, your third point, Bob?
What happened to the poster industry? Did it move to Hong Kong and Taiwan? Right. Did it go underground? Did it die? Yeah.
This poster right here helps us because it says it was printed in Hong Kong. And this one was actually a reprint of one done earlier in mainland China. So it did move to Hong Kong primarily. I have not seen one that says explicitly Taiwan. The fact is, most of these posters don't give us a lot of data about where they were. But I wouldn't be surprised if some were also being printed in Taiwan after 1949.
Did the industry survive in some form?
Yes, in that sense, in that some of them moved their printing presses to Hong Kong especially.
Yes, next question, please.
Hi, my question is, so how effective were these posters? Did people convert after seeing them? Is there any way to know like the data or the numbers of what happened?
It's a really important question, and I wish I had a better answer. Reception history is really elusive history. So what I have are reports from people who use the posters, primarily in evangelism. And not surprisingly, their reports are wildly enthusiastic. People are buying these things like hotcakes, but they're converting by the hundreds. I mean, they have nothing but good to say, but of course, the Religious Tract Society is only going to print that kind of report in their annual catalog or book, right? So it's hard to know, was that everyone? Was this one example? Was this just missionary hyperbole? It's really hard to know. So I can't answer exactly the question. The only thing I can say with certainty is this was the most common form of Christianity in China. If someone thought of the Christian faith, this is what they would have pictured.
I have a follow-up. So like, are there testimonies where people from that time period would say, I came to the Lord because I saw a poster?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that these missionaries, especially missionaries, would write that in, that, you know, Mrs. Loa came and responded that for the first time she understood the gospel and gave her life to the Lord.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, next question, please.
So thank you for this sharing. Wonderful. So my question is, after 1949, Communist Party came to power, Chinese underground church developed our own theology of a cross, cruces.
Right.
So cross is often connected to suffering.
Yeah.
So I wonder in this time period, during for this poster,
right,
also this kind of signal cross connected to suffering or something like that.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question and a great insight. I would love you to take a closer look at the posters and help me see, because I'm telling you, there's so much more to notice. My personal impression was what you're describing is another layer of interpretation that was added to the cross primarily after 1949. In this era, when they were being printed, they seem to really be more about prosperity rather than suffering. But I don't think that those two are completely separate, because you do see a new theology being added on top of the cross, that it does offer a better life, but it isn't necessarily a suffering-free life. And that's a later development, I think, in Chinese theology.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we still have time, but people would like to come forward. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, for your fascinating presentation. I'm curious, what's the relationship between these Christian posters and Christian preachings in the same time period, perhaps in both fundamentalist and the modernist sides, and also Protestant and Catholic sides? And are the two complementary, or is there a certain tension between the two? For example, in terms of miracles and morality, which you mentioned in your talk?
Right, wow, yeah, these are great questions. So in terms of preaching, the first thing that comes to mind is the surprising convergence around some of these posters. In fact, I have a poster, maybe you saw when there's water is surrounding and someone's holding on to the red cross, right?
Yeah.
I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure this is actually a reproduction of a story John Song, who I wrote my first book, talked about. He said he had a vision of China drowning, and he was only able to save people by holding onto the cross.
Interesting.
Now, John Song was the most popular preacher and the most well-traveled preacher in China during this time period. Song Shangjie. I really think that someone took up his story and put it into this poster. Now, again, I can't prove it, but the similarity is too striking and the time period too perfect not to at least notice the analogy. So there you see some convergence around how the posters even are reproducing popular preaching. And in the same way, I think some of the effective preaching gets put into the posters, things that people said, this is working. This is the kind of message that is working. And so you see that also appear. You had more to your question. I got stuck on that.
That's very helpful. Is there any tension you can sense between the two?
Any tension? That's really interesting. If there was some tension, I might say that some of the some of the modernist posters in particular really emphasize things like dental hygiene. You get, and they're marvelous little posters, and they put a lot of emphasis on it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I have never heard, despite what some fundamentalists would have loved to have said, that a modernist was actually preaching the gospel of dental hygiene. And so the posters sometimes expanded their message and allowed them to say other things that they weren't saying in the pulpit.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
I guess one of the questions that I had, your posters pretty much ended in 1937.
The ones that I was showing today.
Okay, and the next ones you mentioned were 49, 50, 51. And the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1937. Did that lead to these posters being suppressed or just being ignored for a period of time?
Yeah, that's a great observation. We do have some posters that were produced in the 40s, not in my presentation. You can find some in the book, or go online. You can search by year at ccposters.com. But you will see a major drop-off in poster production because the heart of poster production was Shanghai. And in 1937, the Japanese occupied the city, and that made it very difficult. They did have some other printing houses elsewhere. The Religious Tract Society was making some posters in Hangzhou, but they describe how the compound was bombed and some of their printing plates were ruined in it. And so they couldn't reproduce some of the posters that they had been printing for years. So you do see that disruption. That's a great observation.
My last Chinese history course was 50 years ago.
You didn't show it tonight.
Another question I have, though, is that when was Formosa, Taiwan, taken over by the Japanese? Right after the Russian, the Chinese Russian.
This is early in the like 1895. So
Okay.
yeah. So
I was just kind of wondering that. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my question sort of pulls together a couple different ideas that I was just thinking about as you were lecturing. First of all, the idea that Christianity as a religion is unique in the way that it can translate into other religions and adopt, parts of that culture and include it into the religion.
Right.
And then also just, I feel like the recent trend of the Chinese church seeking out a lot of discipleship from the Western church. And so I guess I'm just wondering if these posters shed any light on how Chinese Christians at the time sort of held culture and religion together in view of their identity, and what that would mean for Chinese Christians moving forward in this new age.
Wow, that's a great question. So I think you see a fascinating interplay between the way these posters are presenting Chinese culture and the Christian faith. And they're not always consistent. And I think that's representative of what was happening at the time. You have some people who are really seeking out ways to make this look as Chinese as possible. And then you have other people who have chosen to go to the other end of the spectrum and in some ways are making it look as Western as possible. Think of that man in the Western suit, right? But this is not the cultural insensitivity you might imagine. It was trying to tap into another part of Chinese culture, because in this time there was this sense of old China didn't work. That's why we're being torn apart by foreign powers. Why would I want to continue to reproduce the old pictures, the old style, the old culture? We need something new if we're going to be here for another 100 years. And so then there was this wild adoption of Western things. So you get some people who are saying, no, to adopt the West is to forego who we are as a people. What we need is to revive our own culture. And so then you see sort of traditional elements. And you see that mix throughout the posters. What that means going forward is, I think, something very similar. China right now is trying to figure out what it means to be Chinese in this particular situation. Is it resurrecting old Confucianism? Is this what it is? Are we trying to have a nostalgia for the past? The state seems to be promoting that on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also rapidly trying to become the trendsetter in the globe. So I think if nothing else, it's the same tension that we saw here. Not sure if it provides absolute guidance.
Thank you.
Sure.
You have reminded me that I own a picture of my grandfather preaching to a Gansu rural audience, and behind him on the wall is a poster. The question is, this would have been before 1910. Tell us about your era of posters.
Right, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. There are earlier posters that did appear. They were usually not produced in the same scale and certainly not with the same technology that really didn't make it to China till 1920. In fact, some of the earliest posters I have were not printed on paper, but painted onto cloth. And so that could have even possibly been a cloth poster at that time.
Right, yes.
Mine is more a comment. My 94-year-old mother-in-law is Chinese. She was born in Wuhan. Her father was a second-generation pastor. When she was a little girl, they fled down the Yangtze to escape the Chinese, and they went to Chengdu. So I know his church in Wuhan was used by the Japanese. So if there was any Chinese Christian things in there, it would have probably been destroyed. And then I know that she was put on a plane when she was 18 to flee to Taiwan, and but her church said, "You left us before when the Japanese came. We were like a sheep without a shepherd. Please stay." And he was arrested soon after, and she never saw either of her parents again, but the Chinese arrested him. Another thing, in the 90s, I was given a whole box of things by a Chinese missionary. I think her name was Jeanette Cleveland, but I have some of the posters. And when I saw you were coming, I actually reached out to Wheaton College, and I'm planning on donating a lot of it this summer.
Oh, fantastic.
But it's most of it is evangelistic. It's in the cross is very prominent, and it's just really cool to see. And so obviously missionaries used that.
Yeah.
And then another thing, third and last thing, we adopted our daughter from China, from Henan, Henan, when she was 4. We were able to visit her orphanage. Right outside the orphanage was a church with a cross. And I know it was such a symbol for us to know that maybe one reason she was saved and brought to a Christian foster home was because maybe Christians were praying for her, but I also know that a few years back, Hunan, as a province, was one of the first provinces where the crosses were destroyed and taken down.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for all of those personal stories. And let me just take this opportunity. I've actually spoken to a few other of you tonight who said someone in your family has some of the posters or something like that. Before you leave tonight, if that's you, would you talk to me? I would love to give you my email address for a couple of reasons. I don't need to collect them. But what I would love to be able to do is actually analyze them. And you might get on the ccposters.com website and say, oh, you don't need to see my poster because you already have it. But that's not necessarily true. Down here at the bottom is often tiny little detail changes that help me understand how many times these posters went through printing. And so don't assume just because you see, oh, they already have that picture, he won't be interested in mine, when in fact I might really be interested. So stop by before you walk out. Let me give you my email address so we can talk more about any posters you might have.
Thank you. Next question.
Dr. Ireland, first of all, thank you. I mean, what a stunningly brilliant and colorful presentation. As I was listening to you talk about these posters and seeing so much more depth than I would have if I had just looked at them myself, it made me think about a class I took in medieval art. People go to cathedrals and things and they look at all the pretty decorations. But in fact, if you know how they were used in history, the windows, the friezes on the walls and so forth, they were teaching instruments. And they played a part in the ceremony and the life of the church or the cathedral and so forth. They were living ways of telling the story and making it alive through these arts. And so you've got these posters now, and I haven't read your book.
It just came out.
Okay, good. But I would really like to know a little bit more about how these were used, how they played a role in history, you know. So maybe you could just unpack a little bit of this or tell us where this is all going.
Yeah, well, let me tag it into a question earlier about how these were used in preaching. I think part of the way they were used was to instruct people how to see and understand the imagery around them. And in fact, I have seen a film clip now of a Chinese pastor who's actually using a feather brush to walk through the various parts of a picture and explaining why this cross is here, what this sun represents, what this weight on their back means. And so they're giving instruction clues so that when you see other posters or you walk into a sanctuary, you will know the meaning and significance of what you're looking at. So I think you're spot on that this was not just a preaching tool, but also an education tool, giving people a kind of visual literacy for this new symbolic world that they are being invited into.
Very interesting. Now I'm going to tell you something else.
Great.
All right. On my office wall, there is a beautiful image of Mary holding Jesus, looking like Guanyin, painted by Monica Liu, who was inspired by Celso Costantini to stop painting Western style and adopt Chinese artistry and approach. So I'll probably never look at that painting the same way again.
So let me encourage all of you, if you haven't had an opportunity to go to the Chinese Posters website, please do so. The images are there, they're fantastic. Daryl and his team have done a fantastic job putting them in context. I know I myself have used them in lectures for classes I've taught, and actually I've used them with Christians in China too. More to come, we'll talk about that later. But as we draw our time to a close here, I have a question I'd like to ask you, Daryl, and a slightly different kind of question. For those of us who aren't historians, who are not sinologists, what does all of this have to say to us today as 21st century American Christians?
Way to finish on a tough question. I think, Andrew, there are a couple things that come to mind. And maybe first is that sometimes I've felt as a historian that a journey into a different place and a different time is not just discovering a new world, but it's coming to a deeper understanding of myself. That encounter allows me to see things about myself that I hadn't noticed before, or to differentiate myself and notice things that I say, oh no, that's not who I am, this is what I am. And so there's that sense of exploration, not only of a new world, but of myself. Now, that being said, how can these posters say something to us as we think about our world and the world that we are exploring here in North America? 3 things come to mind. First, I would love to think more carefully about popular American Christian art. I think we spend a lot of time at places like Wheaton College and Boston University thinking about getting our theology correct and putting it in books for other scholars to read. But what kind of theology is being presented in Christian films, on streaming services? How are those things making disciples of Jesus Christ? Do we really understand that? So there's one thing. I would also think that it would be really important for us to think about who is being erased in our stories. What's being suppressed? What's being forgotten? And I think there's a twofold aspect to this. One is trying to recover something that could give us life that we may have had but has been sort of pushed aside because it was inconvenient or not very fashionable. But there's also a side in which I think sometimes the light needs to expose what's been hidden in the dark. And there's ways in which, by confessing that this is part of our story too, we might have a reinvigoration. So I think that's really important. And then the third thing that in our particular moment in time that I think is important, sort of back to that fundamentalist modernist split. Right now in America, when we're so incredibly polarized, we're pretty sure what a term means when it's put on another person, and whether we have anything in common with them or if they're or not. You just tell me if you're liberal, and I have all kinds of assumptions, or if you're a Republican. What TV channel you watch. We can just fill in all kinds of assumptions, but I think that this poster project has taught me, at least, we have to pay closer attention. Labels are easy. Getting to understand one another is far more important. If I can say one last thing.
Please.
Before you let us out the door. This book really did just come off the presses. It didn't even go to the normal distributor. The printers had to put them in boxes and rush them here so that they could make it in time for tonight. And this book is not cheap, I get it, but it's filled with 250 beautiful colored images. It's normally $70. Tonight, I'm giving you my author's price, which just is the cost of the book plus shipping it here, $40. But alas, you have to pay for it with a cash or check. And I know most of you probably didn't bring that. But I don't want you to walk out the door without a book if you really want one. You can pick up a piece of paper that has my name and address, and you can send me a check at your convenience. No one has to walk out without a book if you want one tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.